Do we lock up too many prisoners is our question for this hour. And Chris Daw, KC, is a criminal barrister and the author of Justice on Trial, Why the System is Broken and We Can Fix It. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening.
In John Major's speech yesterday, he said, quote, "The punishment of prison is to lose liberty, but the prisoner may lose much else besides, their job, their home, their relationships. That is a high cost for society as a whole." Do you agree?
Yes, it is, and it's not just that, of course. It's the vast cost of imprisonment itself, which runs at about £1,000 a week to keep someone in prison. And when you think about what could be done in society with that kind of money, as opposed to using it to warehouse people in prison, generally, to come out even more criminogenic than when they went in. I mean, it's an utterly counterproductive way to run our criminal justice system, and John Major is right to call it out, although sadly he didn't do so when he was in office.
You used the word warehousing, the verb warehousing. Can we just look at some other potential reasons historically that we've sent people to prison? We'll just try and sort of interrogate them, I suppose, as we go through them. I suppose the obvious one is containment. The idea that you, whilst warehousing somebody, they are unable to commit crimes against their fellow man and woman while they're on the inside.
Well, to a degree that's true, although many people sadly are the victims of violent crime in prison itself.
Well, that's sort of brought that slightly upon themselves, haven't they, by being
Well, there. It very much depends. Of course, you have people in prison who are on remand, who may subsequently be acquitted. You have young offenders and people with severe mental health problems.
People who go in without drug problems who come out with drug problems.
Absolutely, and who go in with a cannabis habit and end up with a heroin habit because it's quicker to get heroin out of your system and pass a drug test, ironically, compared to cannabis, which is one of the strange perverse effects of drug testing in prison. But the main point you make is, in terms of warehousing, there is a degree to which a relatively small number of offenders need to be contained for public safety, and by that I mean literally a minority. Only 31% of people in prison are in for some form of violent crime. The other 69% are in prison for a non-violent crime. And you have to ask yourself, spending £1,000 a week to keep someone contained who hasn't shown themselves to be violent and isn't a risk to the public in that sense, even if it wasn't, even if it didn't make it much more likely that person would reoffend, which it does, of itself, it's just a completely counterintuitive policy.
OK, that's containment. The governor of HMP Winchester said we ought not to neglect or overlook the idea that for some people from very, very chaotic backgrounds, and this will seem a very counterintuitive idea, that being in prison can be a source of stability. It can even be a refuge.
Well, it absolutely is, and I wrote a book on this topic and described the life of one of my clients, who I called Michael in the book, who had been in prison for, I think, 31 years before the age of 52. And when you do the maths on that, you realise that all bar just a few months of his adult life, in effect, he'd been locked up in prison. Yeah. Within a few hours of being released from 8 years in prison, he'd gone out and taken a banana and kept it in his pocket and committed a very low-level robbery of a pub for a few quid in change and was locked up again. And he told me,
robbery. If it was a robbery is a serious offence. If you're a victim.
I'm not suggesting it wasn't a serious offence, although I have to say that the person in this case, the landlord of the pub was robbed, didn't for a moment take him seriously. He was 5'2", and as I say, had a banana in his pocket and was clearly behaving in an irrational way, and immediately ran away with basically a bag of change because he chose to rob a pub at 11 o'clock in the morning. So unsurprisingly, there wasn't much in the till. But he had mental health problems, a long history of addiction, and basically he told me when I went to see him, about the case, and I said to him, you've been out for literally a few days, and he said, I can't live on the outside. I just can't live anymore. Yeah.
Just on mental health, since you mentioned it, the Chief Inspector of Prisons recently said up to half of new prisoners had a mental illness. That's a function of of care in the community, isn't it? That's a function of closing down the old Victorian asylums.
Well, it's not. I wouldn't agree with it. A function of closing down the asylums per se, but it's absolutely a function of failing to provide mental health care in this country at anything like the level required. I mean, we have a mental health epidemic both inside and outside the criminal justice system, and sadly, those in prison receive some of the worst care of all, despite, as you say, a very large number of them having very chronic long-term conditions, which in large measure are responsible for the sort of behaviour that lands them in prison in the first place. So if we If we were to tackle those things, then many people wouldn't get into trouble and wouldn't have to go to prison in the first place.
We've talked about containment. We've talked about stability. Deterrence is another reason often ventured, and it is a deterrent, isn't it? The thought that you may lose your liberty.
It's not a deterrent at all. I'll tell you why. Because nobody who commits a crime does so with a calculated risk, as it were, that they're going to get caught. Every single person who commits a crime of any kind does so in the surefire belief they won't get caught. And if you want the best evidence of that, you only have to look across the Atlantic at the United States, where they have 2.5 million people in prison, the highest rate of imprisonment in the world.
I think I'm always slightly chary, Chris, about drawing too many parallels with America. We do it all the time. I do endless conversations about health systems. We tend to look westwards and never eastwards, and it seems very parochial. Let's not draw. Let's
look in both directions. I mean, when you look, you will find that the countries of the Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries have an entirely different approach to the use of imprisonment, a much lower level of imprisonment and infinitely lower levels of crime. So you can look in any direction, and when you look at the evidence, prison doesn't work. It doesn't reduce crime. We've looked at containment. We've looked at the idea of it being a refuge and deterrence. The oldest reason is punishment. And for some people, it's got the whiff of Old Testament sulphur about it, an eye for an eye, and the like. We need to. Have we used the word victim yet in this conversation? Well, you're asking the questions. You haven't asked me about victims yet, but if you're asking me about victims, the answer is if I were a victim of a serious crime, the most important thing to me would be to try and find a way that it didn't happen to someone else. And
do you think that's how people think? Do you think that's how people?
I don't think people think this way, and that's very, very sad.
They want a pound of they want a pound of flesh. If they've been a victim of a Syrian fire, I think it's understandable.
Is more and more crime because using heavier and heavier sentences, but we've doubled the length of prison sentences for serious crime in the last 20 years, since I became a barrister in the 90s, in fact. And we've doubled the sentences, we've doubled the prison population, and so people are getting more of an eye for an eye, but are people happy with the outcome of that?
Well, happiness is probably the wrong emotion to consider, isn't it? But satisfaction, contentment, a sense of justice. If one of my children was violently assaulted or worse by a criminal who had that intent in mind, I think I'd be preoccupied with punishment. I would want to see punishment, and I think I'd feel I'd no quarrel. I'd like to see the individual concerned rehabilitated. I'd like to see them turn their lives around. I'd like to see them express remorse, but at bottom, I'd want to see them suffer for their actions.
Well, you see that you're right that's an Old Testament mindset, and it is still largely.
Is it wrong?
It's completely wrong because what matters, surely, from our criminal justice system is how do we have fewer victims in the future? What lessons can we learn from the crimes that have happened to reduce crime tomorrow and next year and in the decade ahead? And unfortunately, if you just see punishment as the principal aim of the system, all you end up doing is an ever-spiralling prison population and ever-increasing levels of violent crime. And that's what we're seeing, because that's the policy that lies behind sentencing in this country and has done for at least the last 30 years.
Well, just one final thought. In terms of what's driving that policy, Chris, there seems to have been a shift in recent years to attempting to listen more to victims. And if victims share the view I just expressed to you, that they want to see punishment because that gives them a sense of closure, whatever the emotion is we're talking about, then that is politicians responding to what the electorate is telling them.
Absolutely, it's populism. You're absolutely right.
Populism is a soiled word, isn't it? It's responding to what people think.
It's responding to what people think because people, particularly those who are directly the victims of crime, are not using objective evidence and reason and rational.
So they're being unreasonable.
It's entirely emotional and emotive, and no public policy should be based largely on emotion. And sadly, the criminal justice system is probably more influenced by emotion and less influenced by evidence than almost any other area of public policy.
Well, that's Chris Daw, who's a King's Counsel, a criminal barrister. He's written a book called Justice on Trial, Why the System is Broken and How We Can Fix It. I'm not sure I like the sounds of his measures for fixing it. Is it wrong, as he asserts that it is, for people to suffer for their actions if they've done wrong and been deemed to have done wrong, for instance, by a jury?